Today is May 1st, 2024. My guest is philosopher and author Nick Bostrom of Oxford University. This is his second appearance on EconTalk. He was first here in December of 2014, talking about his book, Superintelligence, about the dangers of artificial intelligence, of AI, and he was way early in worrying about that. His new book, and our topic for today, is Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World. Nick, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks. And there it is. Yes. No, 2014. It's been a while.
Yep. And I'm a lot smarter since then. I'm sure you are too, but neither of us are quite super intelligent. But there's some things out there that are interesting, but that's not our topic. Our topic is your new book. And I want to say before we start, this is a wondrous book. It is mind-expanding, it is poetic, it is moving, it is funny, the writing is superb, every page is full of ideas, and it's about what you call Deep Utopia, the world we appear to be heading toward, a world of unimaginable material abundance, robots, AI able to do everything better than we do, which seems to lead to a world nearly, if not literally, infinite leisure. And in such a world, you ask, among many things, what would become of us then? What would give our lives meaning and purpose in a solved world, as you call it? And what would we do all day? And I think, as you point out, thinking about these issues forces us to think about non-utopian issues, the question of how we live our lives now in what is, for many of us, near utopia, and for many not so close. But let's start off by trying to say something very encouraging. I think many people are extremely uneasy with the idea of a solved world, of the idea of all the leisure we want all the time. Talk about why people worry about that and why you think those worries are not as worrisome as some think.
We've built our conception of ourselves and our dignity to a large extent on the idea that we can make some sort of useful contribution to the world, whether it's at a large scale or just in your family or in your community. And so to the extent that that's the foundation of your self-worth, if that foundation is removed, you might find a kind of vacuum underneath your feet that would be disconcerting. So in a solved world where all the practical problems have already been solved, there are no more problems for us to solve. Or to the extent that there remain any practical problems, they would be better taken care of by advanced AIs and robots. And so either way, there would be nothing of practical utility that human work would be needed for. So that forces then a fairly radical reconsideration of what the foundation of a good human life could be. And undoubtedly, it will require jettisoning some treasured assumptions about what a life should contain. And I think that's part of where this sense of unease would come from. There are also perhaps more mundane concerns that people would have in terms of if they couldn't have a job, like how would they make a living? But those I kind of set aside in this book in order to be able to actually get to the point where we can ask about the fundamental values that are at stake, assuming we solve all the practical difficulties that lie between where we are now and this hypothetical outcome.
And somewhat reminiscent of the conversations some people have had around the idea of universal basic income, where many people have suggested that even if we could, quote, afford it budgetarily, to take care of people at a fairly high minimum standard, it would be a mistake because people that have no reason to work, and then they would, I don't know if you quote or not, but there's a certain, I think, cultural feel that idle hands are the devil's workshop. But you disagree, I think, and quite eloquently.
Yeah, well, I think it might be true for some people in that more leisure is bad, and some people need, I guess, a lot of external pressure to retain their upright posture, psychologically speaking. And I'm I guess, guardedly hopeful that if this were the only change, say suppose there was like some huge economic windfall, like the way that some Gulf state or something finds an enormous wealth underground, and then they can live off the rents from that. Sometimes it works out well, and sometimes not so well. I'm kind of guardedly hopeful that, at least in theory, we could have a cultural change that would allow people to be raised to have good leisure rather than to be productive workers. I think the school system right now is obviously, to the extent that it is aiming for any particular outcome, is aiming to produce disciplined workers. Like, you're told to sit at your desk, you are assigned little tasks to do that you have to do. Why? Because the teacher tells you to do them, and then you're scored and graded, and sort of there's a quality control stamp at the end of it, and then you can go on to work in an office building or a factory, depending on what level of certain. This is a kind of, I think, hopefully by the lights of the future, a sad model of what human development could be. It's kind of necessary now because there are all these jobs that need to be done, so we need to have workers that do them. But if you imagine a scenario where there weren't all of these jobs that needed to be done, then I think we could conceive of better ways of raising children. Maybe cultivating the appreciation of art and literature, the fine art of conversation, a sense of humor, physical activities, appreciation of nature, all of these things that currently are relegated to the sidelines.
And it's one of my favorite themes is that culture is emergent. It's not under anyone's control. It responds to all kinds of forces in the world, economic, improvement, and so on. I get, and we'll talk more about this because it's such an interesting. You have some very interesting things to say about how things might change in a different world. I think there is a interesting question always of the speed with which culture can change relative to the speed of technology. There could be a great deal of suffering and challenge if that culture responds slowly. The example that I think of a lot is smartphones. When smartphones came along, I, like others, would sometimes say, oh, well, our culture will change about what you can do. And it has changed. And it's changed that you can sit there by yourself looking at your phone and answer your phone in the middle of meetings and scroll through your social media feed when you're at dinner and in all kinds of ways that don't seem to me to be consistent so much with human flourishing. And I say that as someone who does some of those things some of the time. So the cultural norms, I think, ultimately will change, but I think there is a question of speed. But maybe we have lots of time.
Yeah, so I'm not saying we would use the increased leisure for positive, life-affirming ends. I'm saying that in theory there seems to be this possibility. We could, so I think there are kind of multiple layers of this onion, and what I see as the outermost layer, which is where most of this conversation both begins and ends, is we are considering some scenario of sort of moderate increase in automation. Maybe some people get unemployed, and then maybe the answer to that is they re-education or flexible labor market so they can find new jobs. Like, we have many jobs today that didn't exist 100 years ago when almost everybody were farmers. So, like, analogously to that. And then combined with some kind of cultural adjustment to the new technologies. So we, hopefully encourage, more positive usage. So I think if the technology were basically frozen in time where it is now, or like, a couple of years more advances and then just applications, I think that would be the right question and the right answer. But I think this is really only the first step on a process that will keep going until it ultimately reach its logical terminus, which is not just that a few jobs are automated, but that basically all economic labor, with a few exceptions that we could talk about, is done better by machine, and where you would have a post-work condition where humans no longer need to do any work for the sake of earning an income. So that's kind of reaches the second layer of the onion, if you want. Like, it's a slightly more radical conception. not just some reallocations where the labor is going, but like the actual cessation of the need for human work. But even that is just an intermediate layer in this onion, because once you start to think it through, what it really would mean if AI succeeded, and then all the other technological developments that would follow in the wake of machine superintelligence, right? Because then this superintelligent AI would be doing the further inventing and innovating and discovery, at digital timescales. And so ultimately, after you have superintelligence, and I think personally, not that many years after you have superintelligence, you would have a condition, I believe, that starts to approximate technological maturity, where most of those technologies that we can see are in principle physically possible have been developed, especially general purpose technologies. And then it's not just that we have kind of the current human conditions, but with a bunch of clever robots going around, getting our grocery delivered and so forth. But a whole host of other things also become outsourceable to machines, and you're beginning to get closer to this condition of what I call a solved world, which is not just that the difficulties have been solved, but also almost like a condition where previous firm boundaries are starting to get dissolved. So you think about like what it would mean, for example, if we had this kind of complete automation, so and technological maturity. It's not just that the AIs could do your economic labor, but a whole host of other things as well that people fill their time with when they don't have to work.
It's interesting to think about one's own job. I used to find it rather marvelous that I liked my job. And I used to, as an economist, I would wonder, in the history of human well-being, how many people enjoy their work. And I used to suggest that the proportion of the world that enjoys their work today is probably at something close to an all-time high. Plenty of people don't. But your book forces me to think about, why do I enjoy my work? If I happen to be very well paid, if I weren't well paid, would I enjoy it as much as I do? If people didn't read the essays and books I wrote for whatever reason, because they didn't have to work and they didn't invest in whatever wisdom I hoped to provide, they didn't read my work, would I still enjoy the practice of setting my thoughts down on paper? And as Bruce Yandel likes to say, the economist, I love my work, but if they didn't pay me, I wouldn't do it. And yet, there are many things we get paid to do, perhaps, that we enjoy sufficiently for themselves. Would that be true of you, Nicholas Bostrom?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy my work, and especially the. I mean, not so much the part that was involving dealing with the university bureaucracy. I think that part I could happily have elided, but the other parts, yeah. But it is possible that a lot of the reason for that is that I feel it's worthwhile, that I'm accomplishing something with the work. In other words, the activity has a structure where you do something X, putting in effort, concentration, in order to achieve something else, Y, that's separate from the activity itself. So like you write the book, and then the result is there now exists this book written by you that hopefully can be enjoyed by other people and maybe affect some positive change in the world. And also you yourself, maybe by putting in this effort, grow intellectually as well through the work you did. But so there's this outcome separate from the activity. And the fact that the activity has this outcome, this causal effect, might contribute to your sense that the activity was worth doing and probably to your psychological satisfaction. But if we now consider this same scenario in a condition of technological maturity, it is no longer clear for most activities that this, for the sake of which, would no longer would still be there. So you can think through the different types of activities that people fill their day. Like some people enjoy going shopping. I don't quite understand them, but that's a common right? So then like that exercises various kinds of human faculties. You have to remember where the good things were. You have to evaluate different options. Maybe you go with a friend and you can sort of develop an understanding of how the other person thinks, etc., etc. And imagine if there were instead some kind of recommender system that could give you that could find for you like something that would actually fit you better than what you would discover if you went and looked for it on your own. Whether it's like some object for your house or some piece of clothing. And you could also just buy it automatically without swinging it by you if it were sufficiently good. So then you would have the situation where, yes, you could perhaps still go shopping, but you know the whole time that the only result of this is that you end up with something worse than what you would have gotten if you had just not bothered. You pay more, it's worse, it doesn't fit as well. Now, in that scenario, it is possible that the kind of appeal of the shopping activity would start to come off a little bit. It would seem perhaps a bit pointless. And similarly for other activities that we tend to fill our leisure time with, for many of them, they have the same structure of you do X for the sake of Y. So you might think, well, right now, like, even if you didn't have to work for a living, maybe you would pull yourself over to the gym a couple of times a week because you want to, remain healthy and fit, and you can't hire a robot to do the Stairmaster on your behalf. Like, that's something you have to do yourself. But at technological maturity, you could pop a pill that would induce the same physiological effects and also the same psychological effect after a good workout, like the kind of relaxed, energized, calm focus that some people enjoy. And so that's
allegedly
be a point on like struggling in the gym for an hour if you could just have popped a pill and had exactly the same effect. So you can kind of go through and start to cross out the activities that fill our leisure, or at least put a question mark on top of them. And a lot, I think, would be crossed out or questioned. And we have then a kind of post-instrumental condition, not just a post-work condition, but a condition in which it seems like all instrumental effort becomes odious.
I've mentioned my granddaughter a number of times. She's almost 2. It's extraordinary to watch her growth. I get to spend a few hours with her every week. And I like to think I'm part of her maturation, her growth in consciousness, her linguistic ability, her passion for owls, you name it. I'm part of her life. And Eric Howell, a past EconTalk guest, had a post recently on his Substack saying, you can teach a 2-year-old to read. It's not easy. Maybe not every 2-year-old can read, but it can be done. And he has a nice, thoughtful essay on whether that's a good idea, a bad idea. And I have to confess that, I think my granddaughter's, very bright. She might actually be. I don't really know. But it's an interesting thought I had. Could I teach her to read in a few months of diligent phonetic stimulation? I showed her the letter P. I explained Papa has the sound of a P, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's incredibly fun, by the way. Unbelievably fun. Yeah. Exhilarating. And you talk about parenting as one of the things that might be something people would focus on in a world without technological limits or without material shortages. And then I think, why do I really want to teach her to read? And is the goal of this kind of, is in the back of my mind, even though it's probably deep below my consciousness, some sort of instrumental goal here that is not actually the joy of just teaching her to read? I don't know.
Yeah, I think these instrumental reasons are so suffused throughout our whole motivation system and psychology that it is quite hard even to imagine what it would be like if all of these instrumental reasons were removed. It's like, a little bug has an exoskeleton that, like the hard shell, basically, that holds all the squishy parts together. And I think analogously, we humans, our souls, have this kind of exoskeleton of instrumental reasons that has always been there throughout our evolutionary history, right? We've grown up with all those instrumental reasons we have to do this for the sake of that. That if we remove all of that, it's like a question of whether we just become amorphous blobs, or whether we would still retain some kind of structure. Human lives, would they still have a shape after we no longer need to do anything? And so we come now to like yet another layer of the onion, where we've kind of seen how at technological maturity you would have this post-instrumentality. But there's one more property, I think, that would follow if you really think what it would mean to have technological maturity, which is plasticity, I call it. But basically the idea that we ourselves, the human biological organism, our brains, our psychology becomes malleable. We would have the tools needed for reshaping ourselves according to our wishes, reshaping our bodies, but also our minds, and placing ourselves in whichever psychological conditions we preferred. Like a crude way you could imagine like some kind of super drug without side effects, and without addiction potential, and like a wide range of different drugs that had very precise tailored effects that you just pick and choose, on a moment-to-moment basis, what your emotional state would be. But more than that, you could imagine, direct brain manipulation technologies and presumably uploading into computers where you could directly edit our neuronal connectivity matrix, etc. And so this removes yet some additional reasons for doing stuff. So you might say, well, the reason I'm going to the gym is to remain healthy. The reason to brush my teeth is so that I don't get tooth decay. And these things would remain. But then you think, well, no, you could take a pill to do that. But then what about like other things people do? Maybe people play golf because it's fun, or they study mathematics so that they will then know mathematics. But here with this condition of plasticity, you see that those also would go away. Like if the only reason why you're playing golf is to induce a subjective state of pleasure and well-being and joy, then that would be a shortcut, with the pleasure drug. And similarly, if the only reason for spending hours poring over, the mathematics textbook and doing exercises is so that your brain, someplace down the road, is in a position where it understands algebra and calculus, etc., that would be a shortcut again, like some direct brain manipulation that would rewire your brain into a condition where it has these skills and concept without the preceding effort. And so then you really end up in this quite radical condition of what I call the soul world, where you really have to think about which things are worth doing, not for the sake of something else, but because you regard them as intrinsically worthwhile.
This does sound a little bit pessimistic. It does, listeners, I will assure you, there's some cheerier thoughts coming from our guest. But I wanted to say one thing about the shopping example, or any of these examples, which is, would I want the thrill of the hunt to find the item that I would ferret out myself, even though it wouldn't be as good as the one I could say find on the internet using this amazing app? And that's an open question, but it's obvious that at least today, you would much prefer, I think, that I bake you a loaf of bread, Nicholas, that was inferior in some dimension up to a point to one I could buy in a store. The fact that I crafted it, that I invested the time for you. So we can imagine these kind of bespoke activities that enhance our human connection that might persist, I think, in a world as they persist now, despite our, I don't think it's irrational to bake bread, even though it's cheaper at the bakery down the street, or even cheaper and higher quality. Sometimes it's fun to do things oneself. But of course, you could imagine that there's a pill I could add to the bread from the store that would make you, I don't know, feel like it's homemade, or that you would like it just as much. I'm not quite sure. Do you want to rule out that personal touch aspect of these kind of activities?
No. I think we're getting towards something. I mean, it's worth, again, making the distinction there between you might bake bread because you enjoy it. Now, then, if the only reason for doing it is the enjoyment in the sense of, subjective positive affect, then that would be a shortcut to that. It would seem like unnecessary to get the whole kitchen dirty when you could just have pressed a button and felt exactly the same amount of enjoyment. But the idea that you're pointing to with the doing things for the sake of others who might just value it because you did it, I think this is an important potential source of purpose in a solved world. So the structure of the kind of inquiry in the book is a little bit like first tearing things down, breaking things into parts, and then kind of seeing what we can rebuild from these basic building blocks of human values. So at one point, yes, we do confront this sense of dissolution, as it were, like everything we normally just assume to be worthwhile and nice, there seems to be no point in doing it, and it seems kind of quite drastically unappealing, this condition that we would reach in a solved world, like a meaningless existence where we're just floating through. And but I think that rather than trying to paper over that or like trying to hide it, I would rather like let's actually dive into that and really think through the full implications of that, and then we can, on the other side of that, try to conceive of an existence that would actually make sense, even in these radically transformed conditions. And I'm kind of somewhat optimistic about there actually being something, but it would be slightly, maybe quite profoundly different from our accustomed human existences.
I was pretty pessimistic before I read your book. I'm much more optimistic, which is rare that a book can have that big effect. So I salute you. Before we move on to some of those more optimistic things, I just want to mention Keynes's famous essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which he wrote in 1930, which is, was one of the things that's interesting about it. It's not a particularly good economic time, 1930, but he wisely foresaw that standard of living would multiply quite dramatically over the next 100 years. We're close to 2030. He expected that would lead to a lot less work. It's led to a little less work since then per week, per lifetime. So he's on the right track, but it did not. It's not a solved world. This world we live in now, and a lot, I think, of what he imagined a world where we could enjoy the pleasure of the moment without having to save, say, postpone satisfaction. It's a very interesting psychological essay. I would add, as I have in the past, that it has a anti-Semitic twist embedded in it. But put that to the side. He didn't get it right, and he imagined a very different. He didn't have your imagination. I'll just say that. Do you agree? Is that a fair summary of Keynes's essay, The Difference Between You and Your Book?
Well, I mean, I think maybe at the time it was maybe quite a radical imaginative leap over the status quo at that time, and now it's easier to imagine this future now because we're much closer to it. We can see AI unfolding, almost week by week, and there have been a lot of work done between his time and now. I mean, it is striking that for a lot of people who are if you grew up in a wealthy country, or reasonably talented and well-educated, like it would be perfectly feasible for most people to work really hard for 10 years and then, in effect, retire and go and live in some low-cost country in Bali and have like nice food and, a nice little, maybe not a big house, but like you could have a nice little cottage by the beach, or like you could probably have a condition that would meet all your basic biological and psychological, but most people prefer to keep, running in the rat mill. And I think this is maybe what Keynes underestimated. I think greed has triumphed over sloth. We do work less, but a lot of the extra productivity we have instead chosen to use for extra consumption, much of which is positional in nature, like trying to get the luxury articles that make us, have higher status than the other people. So it's like a zero-sum element to some of this consumption. But be that as it may, like I think you could reach this condition that I'm describing not by assuming that all human desires would be satisfied, because quite possibly, at least many people's desires are unlimited, but that you would have a situation where even if a lot of people would want even more, maybe they all have trillions of dollars because you have this like super robotic economy. Some people would want to have, a quadrillion dollars and more. So, but it's just they couldn't actually increase their income significantly by working themselves. Just as if you have, say, a billionaire today who have absolutely no skills, like he could work in McDonald's, but like it would make $5 an hour. It's kind of trivial compared to the capital gains he's making from. And so similarly in this situation, like we would be making all our income from either our, like the capital we own, or from social transfers with governments paying UBI or other sources, rather than through direct labor, with a few exceptions that we haven't touched on, but I don't think they are super central.
Before we leave plasticity or flexibility behind, I just want to give you a chance to comment on a recent theme, a surprising theme of this program, which is Robert Nozick's experience machine. The idea that you could simulate certain emotional well-being and experiences mechanically hooked up to this machine, when in fact you'd just be lying on a table, but it would feel like you've cured cancer, you're a great rock star, and so on. And I've remarked, and I'm curious if you agree, it seems to me that in today's world, more people are amenable to that idea than they were when Nozick proposed it. And the idea that you could change your nature, say, or your urges, or whatever aspect of your psychology with a pill or some other device, as opposed to doing the hard work of self-improvement, which I have devoted my life to. Nicholas, can't speak for you, but the trivial improvements I've made in my own character over 69 years would be dwarfed by the pill that you're talking about, or the experience machine of just pretending that I have those changes. Is that where we're headed, toward a real world of experience machines a la Nozick? And is that imaginably a meaningful world to you?
I think the option of the experience machine will become available at technological maturity. We kind of have super crude versions of this, right? Where you could spend your time like watching movies and stuff, or reading even like well-written immersive novels that create this kind of illusory world that you could temporarily inhabit. Or even just some kind of ideological echo chamber online where you like have a lot of other people who just affirm that your views are great and everybody else is stupid. And for a lot of people, that seems like a compelling option.
Utopia.
These will become vastly more powerful as we have, first fully immersive virtual realities, but that's even just like the outside. There's only so much you can do by manipulating the sensory input to the human brain. If you really want to have reliable control of your experiences, you need direct access to the brain itself, right? So you could change like your degree of happiness and your emotions, and then maybe upgrade various faculties and transform your character, etc. So that I think will become possible, and that's in the good scenario. Like the bad scenario is we don't even get to this point because we destroy ourselves in some other way. But the idea that the current human condition, in more or less its present form, would just be continuing on for like the next 2 million years, and then eventually, it seems very unrealistic to me that would be the case. And B, I think probably not even that desirable. We've been doing this for 10,000 years. Like how much more of that, if there is a chance of kind of unlocking the next level of existence, I think at some point, considering all the horrors that are easy to overlook when we're sitting in our nice air-conditioned place, having an intellectual conversation. But if you look around in the world, like it's quite a horror show in many ways for both a lot of humans and for our animal friends, of course, etc. So, but anyway, those are kind of practicalities, perhaps. But if we consider this question of what could we reconstitute if we end up in this solved world, like what values could be salvaged? So I think we have first this very basic notion of pleasure and subjective well-being, which is very easy to sniff at if you are kind of you're like an intellectual, you pride yourself of being important and running away in the world and doing things. And this is the kind of thing that those people who failed out and became like drug addicts, that's what they are. Like, that's clearly not the path. I think actually it is a much more serious alternative than a lot of people are like. I think we dismiss it too readily without even knowing what the heck we're talking about, not having experienced the kinds of bliss that would be possible. And so, now, I think ultimately we could have more than that, but it's not a mere pleasure. I think it's like, I think it basically would be such that if you even when they had a chance to sample the tiniest bit, you would just realize, wow, I didn't realize that's like just, yeah, of course, I like that. That's like the way to go. And we would see our current opinions about that as kind of bigoted prejudice, completely ignorant of what we were talking about. But it's a kind of an intellectually very simple point to make. Like, yeah, of course, if you had complete access to the brain, you could crank up the pleasure. So even though it's very important, I think it's like intellectually not very rewarding to spend, a lot of pages talking about it, because the point is easily made.
Can we pause there for a sec? Can I ask you a question? I'm reminded of Isaac Walton's line when he talked about strawberries. He said, doubtless God could have made a better berry. Doubtless God never did. Ever did? Never did. No. Understand what I mean. I can't imagine a better berry. But of course we could. It could be sweeter, more lasting flavor. The texture could be perfect every time. But one of the things I worry about, and the dystopian view of, I think, the future is Brave New World, where people sit around taking this drug Soma and medicating themselves. It's hard, at least at our current level of humanity, to imagine persistent ecstasy. Maybe cocaine users would disagree with me. It doesn't get boring. But, the finest meal once a year to celebrate your anniversary is magical. Every night, it's not as magical. So, but I think you're trying to say something different about pleasure.
Yeah, well, so right now we are kind of designed in a way that is quite stingy with reward. Like we work hard, like a little thing, and then we have a little achievement and a few drops of reward trickles into our nucleus accumbens or something. And we're obviously not engineered for sustainable bliss. So I think that means in particular that our intuitions of what it will actually be like if we did have that capacity for sustainable bliss are off. It maybe is easier to see the plausibility of this if you consider the other side, where there certainly are people who are sustainably miserable and just horribly depressed for years at an end, like with anxiety and sadness and pain. And so there's no particular reason to think that it would be any more metaphysically impossible to have a consistent state on the upside of that. It's just rarer given the ways our brains are designed right now. And we don't have the technological means to really have much fine-grained control over that. But that would be presumably one thing. You would want to recalibrate the set point for boredom and habituation to joy in this condition, so that you could be more like spend a greater fraction of your time actually enjoying life, as opposed to just dragging your sorry ass through life and putting up with it, which is so that's pleasure, which is really important, and it's kind of without it, really, all the rest seems rather like probably not what you would want to do for thousands of years if you didn't even enjoy it. But if you do have that in place, we can certainly add elements here. So one thing we could add is experience texture. So right now you think of like the drug, just pure pleasure, but nothing else, like just a kind of dazed out consciousness. Well, why not attach the pleasure to, say, aesthetic perception of true beauty, or scientific insight, or genuine understanding of another person, like to some kind of other experiential content that add richness and complexity to your psychological state. Not just as to have a positive hedonic tone, but the sort of informational content is also focused on some worthwhile object, or contemplating God. But it doesn't have to be just pleasure with some sort of dumb state of stupor. Like it could be that same thing, like maybe something closer to what, Archimedes experienced when he, figured out Archimedes' law, like the flash of insight that is very joyous, but at the same time, like a kind of brilliant glimpse into the true nature of things. So that's like another element that we already, it starts to look a lot better. Like if you imagine these kind of spirits being ecstatically happy while contemplating beauty and truth and goodness, that already seems better than the junkie on the dirty flea-infested mattress. But I think we can add further to that. So we could, for example, add purpose. We could have artificial purpose if you think that we also want to have activity and effort as opposed to just passive experience happening to us, that we would be doing things. So games are kind of maybe the most familiar example of this, where you create artificial purpose by setting yourself a goal, and then you have an activity of trying to achieve it. And even if the goal itself is kind of arbitrary, like in golf, like you don't really need to have the ball travel through the holes in sequence using only a golf club to propel it. But you can set yourself that goal, and then once you've done that, then you have this activity that you can engage in and exercise your skill, and then have experiences and pleasure maybe whilst doing that. So nothing would prevent us from creating these artificial purposes at technological maturity. And so you could like have all kinds of wonderful and complex games that we haven't had the time to develop. Now then you might ask, well, that's all nice, but what about real purpose, like kind of things you actually need to do, not just some arbitrary goal you set yourself? So there we can come back to the point that you were making before, is that sometimes we do things for the sake of others. Now, a certain subset of those reasons that we currently have to do things for others would go away, because like they wouldn't need our help in a lot of practical ways that they do now. But if somebody just happens to have a raw preference that you should be doing a certain thing yourself, and they just happen to value that, for whatever reason they happen to value that, then if you happen to care about them getting what they want, then the only way that you can achieve that, even in technological maturity, is by you yourself doing that thing that they want you to do. And so you would then have a real purpose. Like the only way you can achieve your goal of satisfying their preferences is by actually putting in this effort yourself. Now, in this kind of simplified elementary binary example, it looks a bit sort of, uninspiring and hokey kind of, but I think more subtle forms of that are actually quite pervasive, where we as a tradition happen to have developed a commitment and attachment to certain forms of practice, and the only way to honor, say, these traditions is by in ourselves participating in those forms of practice. And there are many more subtle ways in which I think we have these social cultural entanglements. Similarly with like worship, for example, might require us to be doing the worshipping rather than like a gazillion androids who like perform. And one might more broadly conceive of our lives as also being kind of artworks, almost like in this condition, where our own participation is kind of a key element of the idea that is being expressed by this artwork, and certain forms of beauty might then require our own agency. So I think there could also be these forms of natural purpose surviving, like honoring your ancestors might be another obvious instance of that.
There's a certain irony here, seems to me. I recently was talking to Paul Bloom on the program about the opportunity to create an avatar or a robot that would mimic a loved one who had passed away, or instead of having dinner with 5 annoying friends who I can pretty much tolerate, I could have dinner with David Hume and Adam Smith and fill in the blank, whoever would be this remarkable dinner party. I might feel weird eating with those 5 people because I'd actually be alone with those 5 avatars. And you and I understand that in the flesh and blood world that we live in, we still care about other human beings. There might be some unease about living in a fully virtual world, conversation with dead loved ones, say. And the irony is that we could then, in your imagination, change our chemistry, our hormones, our brain, our synapses, to stop caring about that. The guilt I might feel that I'm not actually out with real human beings, or putting in the work it would take for you and I to bond over a meal. And it seems to me there's a terrible irony here that if this technology really did evolve in that direction, I'd be heading toward being more of a machine and less of what, at least now, we think of as a human being, flawed, imperfect, suffering, at least from time to time. And again, as much as I like your book, this doesn't sound like a world. I'm not sure this is a world I want to live in. And maybe it's because I'm burdened.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, you certainly could, in this condition, choose solipsism and change your brain so that you never felt lonely, etc. And live in your pod alone, but perfectly contented, exploring virtual worlds. I mean, you wouldn't have to, and maybe that would be a sad thing to do from the perspective of realizing as many human values as possible. It seems you could do much better than that by being in communication and interaction with other people in this world, in communities with friends and family. I mean, why not?
Well, I think it's a cliche that young people today struggle to interact with each other. They're so used to interacting with their phone, with texting, and with social media that they struggle to interact successfully at the party or at a social gathering. The irony for me is that, we don't teach our children generally how to talk or how to love. We might teach them how to share and a variety of things like that. But it's taken me a lot. I have wonderful parents. Not complaining, but it's taken me a lifetime to appreciate this. Me talking to you, my wife and I having dinner together alone, and so on, and the sacrifices involved. And it's maybe those things can't be technologically fixed easily. I don't know.
Well,
challenge.
I think there are
real
challenges.
Yeah, interaction.
We already see some of them, like just with the alternatives. To like, a few hundred years ago, like the only entertainment was chatting with the other people in the house. Maybe you could read a book. And now, the kids can watch cartoons on television or play computer games or text with their friends instead of hanging out with the old folks. And so there are certainly, even just from present technology, yes, in some ways it can help us connect more, but it at the same time also creates more diversions from spending our time with each other. And so it's a mixed bag in that respect. But yeah, and I think that will be even more the case as the technology advances. And I think actually one of the first places where this will kind of hit is the social companion robots that even just current AI models, and especially if you then add a voice and really good visual avatars, and then maybe with a reinforcement learning loop that trains them to be maximally engaging so that people don't log out. I think quite possibly that might become quite compelling to many people to spend their time interacting with these virtual imaginary friends, as it were, rather than us flawed real world people out there. And yeah, one might feel in different ways about that. I don't pretend to have I think the kind of conventional answer would be, oh yeah, that's really bad because it's the real human interaction is better. Maybe that's true, but maybe the next generation will think, these old people, they didn't really catch on to it. They were too stuck in their old ways, and they don't realize how much nicer life is now when 90% of it is just interacting with these hyper optimized virtual personas. It's really hard with a lot of these things to have an independent vantage point. So it's easy to express a lot of opinions about it, but it's hard to make those opinions mean anything more than just a reflection of your old idiosyncratic personality or your upbringing or the books or teachers that happen to influence you. How do you actually get more down to sort of ground truth on these matters? Is really hard, and if possible at all.
That's all right. It's fun to think about it. You're really provocative in this book in all kinds of good ways. I don't want to miss a chance to mention that you have a fable woven throughout the book, which suggests that the entire discipline of philosophy, or maybe even you could argue, maybe you're trying to say that the whole Enlightenment project is something of a fool's errand. How little progress we've made in understanding ourselves and how we might alleviate the suffering of ourselves and others, and that all we're really good at is this technological game called technology and innovation. But that's such a small part, ultimately, of the human experience. It's not unimportant if you're starving, obviously, but for many, many people, it's not where it's at. There are so many other things that make life challenging and hard. Is that a fair summary? Is that of the fable, and is that what you believe?
You're referring to the Fyodor the Fox?
Yes.
The Beatles, yeah.
It's quite clever and quite entertaining.
Yeah. So yeah, for the listener, there's just Fyodor the Fox. He has a friend, a pig friend, and they try to make a positive contribution. No, I think I think we haven't really seen anything yet compared to what impact technology will have on the human experience, and these much more thorough and direct ways of changing human nature and human life and all aspects of our lives that will become possible with mature technology. But I think the upshot of that is that a lot more of these things become matters of choice. So right now, there have been a whole host of givens. If you're a human, you're born, you die, you spend some time in childhood, and then you have to make a living. And then there are other people, you have to interact with them. You have no choice. Some will be your boss, some will be your friend, some will be your enemy, some will be your mate. And then you have your own human psychology, which you will want to eat when you're hungry, and it hurts when you scrape your knee, and you want to respect, just a whole bunch of these. And then within those parameters, you can kind of define a little niche for yourself, perhaps, and adopt some attitude to these givens. That's your personality and your life philosophy. But a lot of these givens, I think, become variables at technological maturity, meaning that they could take on different values depending on what choices either you make yourself, if you have a future with a lot of individual freedom, or the choices that society makes if you have, that kind of future. But either way, at some point, somebody, whether it's a few people in an AI lab or a government or maybe some humanity-wide deliberative process, like some group of people will have to form some opinion about what kind of future we actually want if this technology happens. And then these are the questions we confront. And I think the answers are not obvious, although they might appear erroneously to some people as obvious. Like a lot of people might come with strong views and strong reactions, but the more one thinks about them, at least that's been my experience, the more one feels it's just really hard to figure out what's up and what's down in this radically expanded space.
Yeah, and your book opens one's mind to that, which I loved. I mentioned earlier the idea that things would change, norms, other things, and you mentioned in passing in our conversation that education is basically in our current world is structured toward productivity, and I think that's correct. It's hard to think of what education would be in a solved world, right? And you spend some time on that. I think it's a beautiful idea to imagine what that might be, because since we're not in that solved world yet, there might be some pieces of that, there used to be anyway, that might be worth preserving, even a world where people would like to be productive. And yet, so much of our culture pushes us toward material success. And the idea that being able to enjoy leisure in a thoughtful way might be a good thing to prepare people for when they're young is controversial.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially if we're now thinking timelines might be quite short. I mean, if you have a young child, I would want to hedge my bets, not assuming that they will never have to work because we don't know how long this will take. But it also means on the other side, it could well be that you have a two-year-old, you said, by the time, 20 years from now, let's say when they are supposed to start to make a living, I mean, roughly speaking, I mean, a lot, that maybe they will never need to make a living, who knows? Or even if they have to for 10 years, maybe it's human labor becomes obsolete, mid-career or something. So, I mean, I would also to some degree try to optimize for actually enjoying yourself while you're a child.
Good idea.
That's one thing they have over us adults in many cases. They're really good at having fun and playing and being creative and fascinated with the world and making up, creating stuff. And maybe we could all learn some from how children live in this workless condition. And we might all become a little bit more like children in this future, including, incidentally, biologically, right? So right now we have this view that you're born, then you develop and grow for 20 years, let's say, and then you sort of stop developing.
It's over.
Right. And then you hold it, and then there's just as you have maybe begun to acquire a modicum of wisdom, it's too late. You don't have any time to use it because your body is falling apart.
Yeah.
Then you get dementia and you die. But imagine if you could continue to grow up, not just for 20 years, but your brain continued to grow and your body became stronger and even more healthy, and you attained new levels of understanding while, becoming more capable for several hundred years. I think maybe then people would think that right now it was a horror, infant mortality was not 5% or whatever it is, but 100%. We all died in our infancy. And it was a big tragedy that, maybe before 2050, nobody ever really got a chance to grow up.
Oh, amazing. You have a page in the book, which I loved. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm tempted to, but I won't. It's called "What to Do When There's Nothing to Do." It's a full page. I'm going to read the little less than a quarter of the page. So here's what to do when there's nothing to do: building sandcastles, going to the gym, reading in bed, taking a walk with your spouse or a friend, doing some gardening, participating in folk dance, resting in the sun, practicing an instrument, playing a game of bridge, climbing a rock wall, playing beach volleyball, golfing, bird watching, watching a TV series, cooking dinner for friends, going out on the town partying, redecorating the house, building a treehouse with children, knitting, painting a landscape, learning mathematics, traveling, participating in historical reenactments, writing a diary, gossiping about acquaintances, looking at famous people, windsurfing, taking a bath, praying, playing computer games, visiting the grave of an ancestor, taking a dog for a walk. And it goes on. That's not even a third of the page. It's a really beautiful list that makes you realize that maybe it'll be okay.
Let's hope so. Yeah, I think so. I think it definitely could be. So it's worth trying to make sure we actually get there.
In many ways, your book is an exploration of what is a life well led. Again, somewhat ironically, given the utopian aspect to it, I take your answer to be a beautiful one to what is a life well led. Your answer I take to be that the answer to that question is not easily written down. There aren't simple rules. We each explore this question if we choose to do so, and it should not surprise us that we come up with different answers. But I also take you to be saying that this challenge of the life well led is maybe just too darn hard, at least in our current very finite lifetimes. Is that an accurate summary of your view?
Yeah, it seems pretty. Yeah, I mean, so that like the question of what's a life well led for a human living under present conditions is already quite hard. And then I think it becomes like intellectually much harder if we have to think about it in this radically transformed condition of a solid world. I think if we're asking the former question for a human under current conditions, we can maybe not answer it, but we could sort of maybe imagine some life that scored high in several different dimensions. And we think like seems like a pretty good life. Like if somebody lives a long and healthy life and raise children and grandchildren that thrive and prosper, and they accomplish some, great scientific discovery that really helps other people alleviate suffering through and then they participate in community activities to, overcome some great evil and achieve reconciliation at the end. And then at the end of their life, maybe they write their memoirs and they're really beautiful, and many people feel inspired to become their true selves as a result of reading this. And also they, had time to just kick back every once in a while and, take in beautiful sunsets and appreciate music. Like if you sort of just cram it full of these different candidates, I think like at the end, that seems like a pretty, probably a pretty good human life for what a human life could be. And obviously you would add the religious dimension to that as well. It's it's like in some like if one pushes that kind of question further, though, it kind of almost become a little bit like somebody asking for life advice. Like this, sometimes people do ask me this in interviews, like, what advice do you have for young people or for people in general? Like it seems a kind of impossible question, as if there were like one advice that would be right for everybody. I think some are too far in one direction and need to be advised. Maybe they need to discipline themselves and pull themselves together. Others are too much in that direction. They need to be told to not be so hard on themselves. And so I think it can be hard to provide general useful insights that apply to everybody. And I think, some of these questions also risk veering into that general purpose advice for like what's the best shoe size or something.
Yeah, that was a very charming part of the book where you read about that. I'm often fascinated by what my students will tell me is their favorite thing or the most interesting thing they learned in my class. And it's usually sometimes not what I would have picked, but that's life as a teacher. In our previous conversation, we had an exchange I have always remembered. It may not have been noticeable to you, but I raised the question in our 2014 interview whether anyone had mentioned to you that your conception of artificial intelligence was similar to a medieval perception of God, omniscient, able to do anything it wanted. I found that a fascinating aspect of that book. And I feel that way about this book as well. I don't know much about Christianity. In Judaism, a messianic age is one where we don't sit in heaven listening to harp music. I don't know if that's a fair summary of Christian theology, but in Judaism, there are some visions of the messianic future when the world is redeemed and suffering is over, but we still inhabit our bodies. And what your book reminds me, and I just want you to react to this because it's for me so interesting, is that whether God exists or not, whether God is dead or not, we increasingly play the role of God. We do the things that religion once thought God did. We cure the sick. We raise the dead back to life. And here you've conjured up an incredible vision of a utopia that is not dissimilar from a certain messianic vision at the end of days, except that we're bringing it without the help of a supernatural or divine entity. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I think there are these structural parallels that with AI, with this utopia stuff. I mean, some of my earlier work on the simulation argument, even more obvious there. But I do feel also that there are like questions that are above my pay grade. In the book, this fictionalized version of Professor Bostrom is deferring to another Professor Grossweiter, who is like not actually appearing in the book. But whenever these theological questions come up, he tells the students, you should ask Professor Grossweiter about that. And I'm tempted to pull the same trick here. I mean, but honestly, I feel like a lot of this is, I think there are more things on heaven, in heaven and on earth than is dreamt of, certainly like in my philosophy, but it's hard to know exactly what to make of that. But I think like it is, for better or worse, or like we do seem to be like humanity is kind of heavy with child in some sort of way. If we give rise to this AI superintelligence stuff, then it does seem like these things will follow. And I guess we have some kind of role or responsibility in trying to shape something sensible out of that. But this is my effort to try to like start to think through what that might mean. But I'm kind of it's quite possible that I am, and maybe we will all be missing some crucial part of the whole equation here, and that we will make a big mess of it. That seems like kind of what you would expect of the human species to do. Like, especially if we get our hands on this like completely unprecedented technology that's like way more powerful than we not even a trial error. This is like how we sometimes manage to get to some semi-adequate result. Like we iterate, try every possible way of doing it wrong, and eventually through like many hard knocks, kind of slowly converge unstably to some kind of tolerable way of going about things. But this would be like a different order of challenge. But that seems to be the challenge placed in front of us, and so we'll have to do our best, I guess.
Before we close, I want to ask you about an idea you put forward that I found quite novel. You argue that the modern world reduces enchantment. Enchantment is a word you don't hear much in the modern world, maybe because we have a lot less of it, maybe because our language is a little bit too Spartan, and spare. But I think you're right. I don't think we have enough enchantment in the world, and I thought your observations of why that is were very thoughtful. So explain why you wrote that, and how we might find more enchantment.
Well, so it was the attempt to put a word to a slightly amorphous, vague notion that I had. And it's in the context of considering different kinds of subtle value that would be at risk of being lost in this condition of a soul world. And so one can then analyze each one of them. And so there's like meaning and purpose and significance and interestingness and a bunch of others. And so one candidate subtle value is like this idea of enchantment, which is the idea of a sort of high bandwidth way of interacting with a reality. So maybe it's easiest to understand if we contrast it with the absence of enchantment. So imagine a world where your life consisted of you sit in front of a screen and a little task pops up, a little text describing some analytic task that you have to perform, maybe requiring a lot of creativity and drawing on your knowledge, and like a lot of intellectual skills would be required to find the answer to this, let us say. And then you input the answer, and if you solve your task, you get a little reward pellet that gives you all the nutrients you want and some predefined quantity of pleasure. And so that's now your life. Now, so we can say what seems to be missing in this life. Like you would have a kind of purpose, like you really need these reward pellets because otherwise you starve. Like it wouldn't be like the life of a junkie never doing anything. You would be really, using the full range of your intellectual. But there nevertheless seems to be something missing. And I mean, in fact, there are many things missing. But one is that it seems in this scenario, in this thought experiment, you're kind of interacting with reality as it were through a straw. Like there's a very thin connection between what you're doing and the effects of reality. It all goes through this little narrow interface on the screen. Whereas in real life now, it's not just even the choices you make, but it's like how you make them, your facial expressions, like your emotions while you're doing them. All of these things have effects on the world and shape how other people react back to you. And so you might think that the human life is richer if it calls upon us to use all the different modalities that we have, not just our abstract thinking, but like our self-control, our emotional apparatus, even our bodies. If all of that is involved in like getting on in life and achieving something, that might seem a more enchanted life. And I think traditional forms of, like if you imagine living where you thought that every little river had like a special God living in it, so then it's not just a matter of, as it is now, like you go down to the water, is the water clean enough? Otherwise you have to boil it before you drink it. It's like kind of a reductionist view of relating to the river. But if you thought that was a God living in it, maybe you would have to think in terms of the personality of this God, and are you approaching the river with the right reverence, and how are you talking about the river might make a difference to the quality of the water you get from it. And so to some extent our existence has already been robbed of some of this enchantment, I think, and in some of these future scenarios the remainder could also go, and that might be a loss of a certain kind of value.
I guess a lot of the time we'll be watching in the future, we'll be watching Midsummer Night's Dream, but with the greatest actors and actresses that we could possibly, which we can't even imagine. And we could be enchanted every evening with aesthetic beauty, as you mentioned in the book, and today as an example. Last question. Are you looking forward to the future?
Yeah. So am I an optimist or a pessimist? So this is like So I used to say that I'm a fretful optimist. So I'm optimistic, but worried that we might not actually realize the optimistic outcome. Then I took to saying I'm a moderate fatalist, meaning that a lot of the uncertainty about how well things will go is quite plausibly baked into how hard the challenge is that we will have to solve, as opposed to uncertainty about the degree to which we get our act together and make an inspired effort. But moderate, because we could at least somewhat nudge the odds towards the better. But then I started thinking, like, I don't even know whether I'm optimistic about the present. it's actually pretty hard to try to form some all things considered assessment of the planet today, with all the wonderful things that exist and children smile and like all the beauty, etc. But then you put on the other side of the scale, the people in the cancer wards, and like the pigs in the animal factories, and just the mundane stuff like the headaches and the tedium at the dead-end job that you don't enjoy, etc. And you try to sum that up. It seems like the scales basically break when you try to do that. So it's a hard question for humans, I think, to try to answer.
My guest today has been Nick Bostrom. His book is Deep Utopia. Nicholas, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Good to be with you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.